Welcome to LTX Quest. I am here today with Dr. Manuel Pastor, and we're going to be talking about solidarity economics, why mutuality and movements matter. I'm Betty Francisco, and I'm the co-founder of Amplify Latinx, which is a collaborative movement to build Latino economic and political power in Massachusetts. I'm also the CEO of Boston Impact Initiative Fund, a social impact fund dedicated to closing the racial wealth divide in Eastern Massachusetts. We invest integrated capital, equity, debt, grants, and everything in between in regenerative local enterprises that are owned and controlled by entrepreneurs of color or are serving communities of color. At the center of our investing strategy is the need to build an economic system that self-organizes around regeneration and solidarity, a system that puts people, relationships, and planet first, rather than competition and profit, and that centers democratic decision-making and power in the hands of workers and community. So with the current social and economic climate where we see income and wealth inequality at its highest levels around the world, where we have irreversible climate change and disrupting national economies and affecting the lives of millions of people, we have to recognize that our current economic system is no longer sustainable. And this is why I'm thrilled to lead this conversation today with Dr. Manuel Pastor, who is one of the leading researchers and thought leaders on solidarity economics. Dr. Pastor is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He currently directs the Equity Research Institute at USC, and he's dedicated much of his research on issues of economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities, and the social movements that seek to change those realities. He's the author of 4 books, and his latest book on solidarity economics, co-authored with Chris Benner, is due to come out this fall. We're all excited to read it, and I want an advance copy, please. Welcome, Dr. Pastor. We're so excited to have you at LTX Quest, and would love to start with a little fun facts about you and your origin story. We'd love to get to know you a little bit better.
Bueno, gracias. Qué placer estar contigo esta mañana, o tarde, o lo que sea. Since we don't know when this will be broadcast. So I was thinking about it, and I think perhaps the funnest fact, I don't know whether it's total fun, but it explains a little bit about me, is that I'm Cuban American, and I was born in New York in the 1950s from a dad who was Cuban, who came over in the 1930s. Came over as an undocumented immigrant to look for work in the middle of the Depression, was given a choice between being deported or joining the U.S. Army, couldn't figure out what to do, so he gave up bidding to my cousin Carlitos, who flipped it. That's how the decision was made. He came back to New York after the war. He met my mom, who was also Cuban, but had been born in Tampa, grew up in Spanish Harlem. But when I was 6 months old, we moved from New York, from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. Actually, we moved there because my sister had asthma, and the doctors were saying that moving to Los Angeles would be good for your asthma. I think they didn't know about smog.
Right.
A little crazy. But what I think is kind of interesting about that is that I'm Cubano, but not of the generation that's the bulk of people who came fleeing the Cuban Revolution. We actually grew up poor, came from a poor working class background. And then I grew up in a largely Chicano, Mexicano setting. And at the sort of height of the Chicano movement, I have a friend, Guillermo Gomez Peña, performance artist, who once said to me, I'm not sure if you're Cubano or Chicano, maybe you're Chibano. But what I liked about that was that I got a lot of experience growing up about looking at things from several different angles at the same time. Being Cuban, but not quite part of the mainstream Cuban experience. Right. Being effectively Chicano, because how could you not be if you grew up in Los Angeles as a Latino in the 60s and the 70s, be infected by the vibrancy of the Chicano social movement? but not quite part of that. And I think that insider outsider is actually a really important skill I bring to being able to understand the role of social movements and the role of capitalist enterprise in how you form a more perfect economy.
Oh, that is awesome. And what's a fun fact?
Well,
Nobody knows about you.
I don't know. I thought all of that was pretty fun.
Yeah,
But
it was.
the one fun fact, perhaps, is that I'm a devotee of hip hop music. And I began a graduate course today showing a video of Anderson .Paak performing Lockdown. And all of my supposedly hip, young grad students had never seen it before. And they were sort of wondering why their professor was a better fan of hip hop than they were.
Wow.
That's a fun fact.
That makes you ultra cool. Ultra cool.
Or as we say, bien cool.
Bien cool.
But I want to know, Betty, about you. You have a really unique background from our conversations before and getting to know one another. And it feels like that's a place where we bond about being inside and outside and learning what it means to translate between people and experiences. It's a skill so many Latinos have, but it seems like a skill that you've got in abundance.
I have to say I've learned to have it, right? So I am what I call myself Chino Rican. My mother is Puerto Riqueña, de Añasco, Puerto Rico, which is a tiny beach town on the western side of the island. And my father is Chinese. He was born in Shanghai, but grew up in Taiwan. And my parents met in New York City in a restaurant. So my father was a waiter there. And he met my mom and se enamoraron, no sé qué pasó ahí, but it was just, they got married. And had me. And I always wondered, how did they really communicate? Because neither one speaks English that well. The one thing that I feel like bonds both of these cultures is very much this centering of family first, the community, right? And then also the food. So rice is the bond between both my Puerto Rican and Chinese family. So I love, I shared with you, I think, this has been for me an evolution of identity. So growing up, I was born in New York, but lived in Puerto Rico when I was young, from when I was 5 to 11. And over there, I was called La China, La Chinita, La Chinita Linda, La Chinita Fea, and I was always an outsider. I felt like I was an outsider, but yet I felt frequently like I was a fly. I could be the fly on the wall, right? Because people didn't think I understood. They didn't think I could speak the language sometimes, but I could. And even now, people assume, right, that I am Asian. And often I am the shocker, right? When I then respond back and speak in Spanish, they're like, pero yo no sabía que tú hablabas español, no sabía que eras Latina, and they make all kinds of assumptions. And I've learned to both accept, right, that being multicultural, bicultural is both, I used to see it as a curse, but now I've completely embraced it. It just took me many, many years. And it gives me this opportunity, right? I didn't learn my Asian side so much, but I wanted to, and I do often cross over, right, into multiple communities, both Asian, Hispanic. And then my husband is Honduran, but Black. He's what we call Afro-Latino. And so that's given me also another perspective for my family.
But you all are the new majority in one household.
New majority in one household, absolutely. Because, when I go to places now too, it's created a new sense for me that I have, because of my family now, I have to center Blackness. I have to center the Black experience because that is so real in my home, right? And we saw this last year in 2020, after George Floyd, all of these emotions started to come out. And I had them, I want to say 2x, because the fears that my husband has as a Black man, right? And trying to empathize with that, and the real fears I had, that what if something happens to him? And then there was all the anti-Asian, yes, right? Xenophobia, the xenophobia against the Asian community. And I was afraid also because of that. So, it both is a blessing and a curse. I can code switch. I call it code switching, right? Like I can go into multiple places, multiple spaces, and learn and adapt and collaborate, and bring different identities and experiences to a table. And I think that's a huge asset, right? We've been told that we are not assets, right? That we're deficits oftentimes as immigrants or Latinos or people of color. And I view all these identities as huge assets to be able to contribute and bring forth new ideas, drive innovation, and just push people, right, to think differently. So thank you. I love our ability to bond across identity, because it's, although we consider ourselves Latino, we have very unique Latino experiences.
The idea of Latino is itself so complex. I know when I start a class I've got on Latinos in the United States, I always start by playing Ruben Blades, Pedro Navaja, and telling the story about here is Nuyorican music brought forward by a Panamanian whose signature song, Tiburon, is an anti-imperialist song. But he himself was the son of a Panama Canal guard protecting American imperialist interests in Panama. And the song Pedro Navaja is a riff on Mac the Knife, which he learned listening to Bobby Darin sing it, but it actually comes from Bertolt Brecht, Capra, a German sort of communist sympathizing opera. And all of that is part of a Latino experience. And you embody that so richly. There's a great book by Viet Nguyen, who's a friend, called The Sympathizer, in which the lead protagonist is half Vietnamese and half white. And his mother keeps telling him, you're not half of anything. You're twice of everything.
And that is going to be the new motto. You're twice of everything. Yes, yes. So many of our young people, Manuel, need to hear that, because, they're told they're nothing. And in fact, they have, they're multicultural, they speak two languages, they can code switch inside or outside their strategy. And, that to me is twice of everything. So thank you. I'm going to get us started in our conversation about solidarity economics now. So you've dedicated much of your research around equity and movements. You've documented how activists and policy shifts began to change communities, particularly California and the California economy. And I was struck by your research there around how much California shifted from the 90s, right? Very much anti-immigrant sentiment, then to, seeing many movements by the immigrant communities there to start to build some local power and drive change. So I'm really interested in that, in how California did it in particular, because in Massachusetts, I think we have a lot to learn from what California did. But also within that, if you could share what is the solidarity economy and solidarity economics, right? So how do you define it, and why is it? What are its core principles? I think people would love to understand that a bit better.
So a lot there in one question. Let me start with the California story. And I think the first thing to realize is that sometimes when people look at California, they say, well, that's the left coast, it's very progressive. There's nothing that you can learn from it because it's just so crazy liberal. People forget that we are the state that gave you Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, the John Birch Society, anti-tax fervor, anti-immigrant xenophobia, 3 strikes laws,
Right.
and just about everything else. And actually, in the early 1990s, we were affected by sort of 3 big phenomena. One was that there was a huge economic recession in the state, causing tremendous economic uncertainty, because we were a state heavily reliant on defense spending. And when the Cold War ended, that really knocked the legs out from under our economy. Half of the job losses in the country were in the early 1990s occurred in California. Second, there was a lot of reaction to demographic change. The demographic change in California between 1980 and 2000 is the demographic change the United States is going through between 2000 and 2050. And as the state was moving in the direction of becoming people of color, there was this racist and xenophobic backlash. And then the third big phenomena was that there was a lot of attempt to profiteer from political polarization. People forget that Rush Limbaugh began his talk radio career in California, where he perfected the art of hate radio. So economic uncertainty, racial anxiety, profiteering from that anxiety and political polarization sounds a lot like Trump's America. And what is interesting is that in some ways, California is America fast forward. It's America fast forward in terms of the demography, which I talked about. It's America fast forward in terms of economic transformation. And it's America fast forward in terms of the social movements that were built to try to change this state. This is now a state that is leading the nation on addressing climate change. This is a state, imperfectly, that's trying to protect immigrants through legislation called the California Values Act. Think about that. This is a state that was one of the first two states to raise the wage, minimum wage, to $15 an hour. And all of that came from not just sophisticated political leaders, but from grassroots organizers who recognized that they needed to do a couple of different things. Understand the changes that were going on, provide a narrative and a story for people to experience and get through them, and to provide a policy package and accountability and voting strategies to try to get people in power that would actually change things. And that is what we need to do in America right now. Put a lot more money into community organizing of the type that turned Georgia blue. Create mechanisms to hold folks accountable politically. And that's a lot of what organizing can do. And to create new political leaders who, like an AOC, can actually anchor a very different political point of view. So all of that, I think, comes from the California experience, and it's something that we need to do nationwide. But one of the biggest things we need in terms of narrative is an alternative narrative and theory about our economy. And that's what is the genesis of this book, Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. The book is just now coming out. And if you've ever written a book, you will know that one of the frustrating things about writing a book, you would think it's the beginning or the middle or the copy editing. It's when you're done and you realize your entire book can be encapsulated by 3 key points. And you wonder, why did I write such a long book? But the 3 key points in this book are the following. Number 1, we need to stop talking about the economy and always talk about our economy. When we say the economy, it makes it seem like it's a system of natural laws, like markets, that somehow determine what's going to happen. But the way that we're organized is not determined by nature or by God. It's determined by who holds power, who writes the rules, who benefits from the tax structure, who owns capital, etc. So it's our economy. We made it, we can change it. Second is we need to understand that mutuality, caring for each other, can actually generate more prosperity. We've been drilled over and over into our head that fairness might be something that you care about because you're a liberal, soft-hearted, You want to be fair to people, but it's going to cost us prosperity. But studies after studies are showing that those, for example, metropolitan regions with lower levels of inequality, less residential segregation, less social fragmentation, are actually able to sustain job growth better over time. The International Monetary Fund, not known for its leftist leanings, has looked at country growth and found out that those countries that are more equal are able to sustain GDP growth better over time. And when you think about this, when we exclude people by virtue of their legal status, we are losing all of their potential economic contributions. We're not maximizing those. Okay. When we over incarcerate, we're throwing away talent. When we underinvest in education for Black and brown kids, particularly Black and brown kids in low income areas, we are kneecapping our economic potential for the future. We need to understand that mutuality is key to our prosperity. When there are co-ops, something you're working on, you see more growth. When you see companies that treat their employers, their employees, their consumers, and their customers better, those companies prosper in the long run. A Starbucks does better than a company that's pursuing the low road. Third key point is that movements matter, and they do for two reasons. One is that even though mutuality would benefit most of us, some people do benefit from the current constellation of policy and power. And until we build community power, and until we diminish the power of the wealthy over politics and rulemaking, we're not going to move to an economy that's truly mutual. So we need movements to change the constellation of power. But we need movements for one other reason, and then I'll stop my professorial rant. We often think about markets that people are self-interested, and then they go into markets and maybe blissful things can happen. What we don't count on is the fact that markets actually make us selfish. When you're in markets that force you to compete with people, you start to think about your own interest and not others. There's really interesting research showing that students who take more economic classes become more selfish and self-interested, and actually, interestingly, wind up making less money because since they're treating other people unfairly, they don't secure a lot of loyalty. Mm-hmm. Ties into the second point. So just as markets make us selfish, movements make us mutual. The exciting movements of this past year, which have centered, as you mentioned, the struggle against anti-Black racism, have made us more mutual, those of us who are not Black, to understand the struggles of Black Americans, of Afro-Latinos, etc., and to be able to truly understand those as our own interests. Seeing the wave of anti-Asian hate has helped us to understand why it is that even though some Asian groups are doing well economically, they are permanently othered and considered to be foreign in ways that diminish their possibility to fully participate and to fully be respected. Movements make us mutual. They help us to understand other people. They help us to build solidarity.
Wow. So I want to study under you now. I want to go to USC and become a student with you. Because so much of what you shared is, I went to law school and business school. I was not taught any of this. I self-learned by starting my own initiative several years ago, which was really a network for Latinas to support them, to mentor, provide, we call sponsorship, so they could advance into positions of power and influence. And that small network grew into a couple of thousand. And back in 2016, when we had our shift to the Trump administration, realized we as Latinos need to build more political power. We need to be more civically engaged. we need to come together, and stop the siloing, because we have a lot of silos that they're often, driven by geography, but oftentimes by culture, country, and also by race.
Yeah.
But this network and this initiative, which became Amplify Latinx, right? This movement to build economic and political power for Latinos in Massachusetts, is rooted with the bigger goal of building power so that we can advocate, so we can become civically engaged leaders in our communities, and activate, be activists and activate movements, and through that ultimately drive forth economic mobility for a community, and create more places where there's again, changes that drive forward parity in leadership, in ownership, in opportunity. And so that's taught me a lot around how we need to collaborate. And so it's gone beyond, Manuel, just Latinos, right? Last year again taught us that for us to really accelerate our movements, we have to work with the Black community. We have to work with the Asian community, the Indigenous community, and we have to support each other's movements, advocacy, and policy change, right? Together, because we're much more powerful when we do it in mutuality, but in collaboration. And I've seen that, right? Where one group was advocating on their own for more contracting with businesses of color, could not make a big dent, right, with decision makers. And we then came together, 12 leaders that were multicultural, multiracial, representing different communities. And when our political leadership saw that, they're like, uh-oh, aquí vienen, but that worked. It actually worked because it got the ear, right, of our established leaders, and said, wow, we didn't think that they were working together. And now there's true accountability, right? We have to be more accountable. So it actually resulted in change, and quick change, because of the fact that there was what we call you can call it BIPOC, you can call it Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Asian, but we're seeing more of that today, right? Less so, it was almost very, Black movement or civil rights movement. You saw some of the collaboration with, like, say, the Chicano movement in California and in New York. There, Black and Puerto Ricans would work together too on social justice movements, but it's now necessary, right, to really transform what you were talking about, to be absolutely transformative and to transform economies. So I want to go back to
just one point on that, though, because I think that's been a big shift in economic thinking, which is the point I was talking about, in political thinking and in movement organizing, which is you used to be taught that what you needed to do is to build your empire. My little circle of economic power, my little point of political influence, or my particular community-based or social movement organization. But we need to shift from building empire to building ecosystem. That is, when you grow a group of firms or a group of Latinas together, that each and every one of them is going to be more successful, more powerful, because of the ecosystem that you're in. When you are trying to compete with other ethnic groups for your slice of the political pie, rather than trying to say, how do we get more voice for everyone, and how do we bring each other's interest into account, that grows power. And similarly with community-based organizations, when as an immigrant rights group, you step up around Black Lives Matter, when as a Black-led group, you step up around undocumented immigrants, you're building an ecosystem of organizations that can power true change and true transformation. Key point from what you lifted up.
Absolutely. I snaps to that, because that is something, again, that's happening here. It's happening across the country, but I'll do another selfish plug in Massachusetts. So more in the space I play, which is supporting small businesses. What we saw was, last year, when the economy basically shut down, and there was this, federal government quickly tried to put in place the PPP loan program, right, to support small businesses. The tiny ones, the Latino, Black, Asian, Indigenous ones were left out, right? Mostly from that first round. So in Massachusetts, a group of our community leaders and organizations, including some banks, came together and said, what can we do to ensure that in the second round, our businesses are not left out, right? Our Black, Latino, immigrant-owned, low-income-owned, entrepreneur-owned businesses. And so this initiative was nothing like I've ever seen. I didn't even know these organizations existed until we started to come together around this mutual goal, right, of helping these small businesses get access to this critical funding. And we met day and night over a period of a month. So we built close relationships. So talk about, relationships are at the heart of movements and mutuality too, right? You've got to be deep in relationship. You've got to understand local players, right? So the reason we could be all effective is because we knew the local businesses.
Yeah.
And so we're able to find them, get the word out. We took on the role of going after the Latino businesses, right, that needed Spanish access to information. And that whole initiative, I will tell you, then led to what is now called the Coalition for an Equitable Economy in Massachusetts. So it's an effort by, a lot of players across the small business ecosystem to create a more inclusive, equitable economy for our businesses of color, and to create economic, parity by 2030. I don't know if that will happen, but the fact that we're working together in a way that has never been seen before, and a core tenet of our work is policy and advocacy. So we've been able to advocate for millions of dollars in increased funding for driving, more opportunities for things like in our solidarity economy, we talk about things like worker ownership, right? Co-ops. In my world, which is social impact investing, it's transforming how we think about investing and exits, right? So having structured exits that allow some of the profits to not just to accrue to us as an investor, but to the founders and the workers, right? And it's not about maximizing return at the expense of those that built the business that we've invested in. So
I'm so glad that you went to the social impact stuff, and it was really hoping you would talk about it. One thing I think that's leaping out from what you just said too is something I always talk about, which is that you need to make sure that equity is baked in at the beginning rather than sprinkled on at the end. So they knew when they were rolling out this PPP support that was not designed for the smaller businesses, for the businesses of color. And you knew that if you designed it right, you could get there. And I think that's really key. We need to start thinking about equity as a kind of special interest side issue that we deal with after we get our economy to grow. And instead understand that if we center it, if we bake it in from the beginning, we're actually going to grow assets and grow our economy.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why, having a coalition of players that believe that in their values, right? And it's within the coalition itself, we value and prioritize, even in decision making by those most impacted. So leaders of color making decisions, right? Having those most impacted be at the table, informing, right, these programs also, because we're going to see a lot of money, right, in the next 2-3 years coming from the federal stimulus. And again, the decisions around how it's getting used are often not coming from us, right? So we're saying, no, we're at the table actively informing our decision makers on how we think it can be used to create more equitable opportunities and outcomes and access to capital and resources for our businesses.
This is one of the things that's a cutting edge for us in California, is trying to, and I hope elsewhere somebody plant the seed, is coming up with equity metrics right at the beginning so that we can guide this spending in a way that actually opens up opportunity. And so we don't feel like we're doing repair damage afterwards for our shortcomings, but we've got some metrics that we can use to hold policymakers and bureaucrats responsible in terms of the spending.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. I want to give our audience a little bit more context, more examples that maybe they can relate to, because even I'm in my continuous learning journey, and often when I hear things like cooperative businesses, worker-owned businesses, um, these sort of concepts that often are in our Latino, in Latin American societies, gifting, right? Invisible economy activity. Are there some things you're seeing in California or elsewhere that are really strong examples of solidarity economy and things that are moving the dial? And how can and what's driving them, and how can we do more of that? So I just want to give the audience some concrete examples they might relate to. Could be even a business that they might know of.
So one of the things I would say that we were trying to open up with this book, is the fact that when people say solidarity economy, they're often referring to worker co-ops, cooperative enterprises, and then also land trusts, where people buy land and do housing development. Those things are occurring. For example, we've got some good land trusts in Los Angeles that have done a great job picking up buildings that were going to be taken off of Section 8. Section 8 are the programs where low-income people pay only a particular share of their income for the rent, with the rest subsidized by the federal government. And making sure that those buildings get redeveloped, bigger, with more Section 8, not less. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of that going on. One of the things we were trying to do in this book is to expand a little bit the definition of solidarity economics, because I think co-ops are great. Whether or not we can scale them up in time to deal with climate change, automation, etc., is a little bit tough. We should be doing it, but what we should also be doing is understanding where, in fact, there is mutuality in the economy already and how to encourage it. I'll give you a couple of different examples. This is my iPhone. You could make fun of me because it's a model or two behind, but nonetheless, it's an iPhone. And normally what we would do is we would say, man, that's a great invention. That must all be about Steve Jobs and Apple. But half of the patents in this iPhone were paid by public tax dollars in the form of basic research and development. And yet Apple profits from really what was a set of mutual investments. Mm-hmm. What makes this phone so useful? It's a computer and it can go on the internet. Who came up with the internet? Not Google, the government. Right. So there's a lot in our economy, even in the realm of innovation, that comes from our own public investment with no return. So why not think about a tech dividend? That is, wealth taxes, in particular on some of the high-tech companies that can go back to pay for universal basic income, particularly for lower income people. Or think about how Google and Facebook make money. It's off your information. Right. And your information is only useful when it's pooled with other people's information. Do you make any money from that? No. Should you? Yes. So how do we think about a tech dividend from what is the commons that we invest in with public tax dollars and R&D, or the commons of our data? How do we lift up companies that actually, they may not be co-ops, but they're a lot closer to solidarity than you might think? I happen to hold an endowed chair at the University of Southern California. In fact, the endowed chair is that wooden chair in back of me. I didn't realize they would give me a real chair. But I asked the gentleman who uh, gave quite a bit of money for this endowed chair on civil society and social change. How he made his money.
Mm.
Why are you so rich? I asked him. How were you so successful? And he said, well, I treated my workers right. I treated my customers right. And I treated my suppliers right. And there are a lot of businesses that are pursuing the high road, that are trying to do a better job. How do we lift up those businesses and provide them tax incentives and penalize the companies that are trying to pay very low wages,
Mhm.
that are damaging the environment, that are not paying attention to community? So I think that's a very important thing to do, to go beyond co-ops and
Yeah.
get a little bit broader. And then one big part of this is the caring economy. And I think it means two things. One is recognizing that America is aging and the caring sector is growing. And gosh, wasn't that illustrated to us during the COVID era when in particular women, I bet you felt this a little bit too, have been caught between taking care of kids and taking care of parents.
Right.
And we need a lot more investment in the caring economy. Why don't we do it? Because so much of the burden falls on women, and sexism in public policy making leads people to say that's costless when in fact it's extraordinarily costly. So we would be a lot more mutual if we paid attention to the caring economy. Last thing about caring. Well, about that, it's not just about the workers who care for your parents or your kids, but whether or not we care for them with higher wages, better working conditions, and a path to legalization. But the other thing I think is that we celebrate high tech, the driving sectors of our economy. We forget that behind every software engineer is an army of nannies
Right.
and gardeners and food service workers. And that unless they're paid decently, unless we make sure that they too find housing, we can't actually sustain the driving sectors of our economy. For too long, we thought about making our economy grow as investing in these driving sectors, these leading lights, without thinking that we also need to lift the bottom and grow the middle at the same time. And that a solidarity economic strategy would see no contradiction between supporting high tech and driving the minimum wage as high as we can.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, so a lot of what you just said, in terms of recognizing, and you're in a particular, I mean, you are at the heart of, California, like Silicon Valley, the tech and high tech economy there, which I hear every day, right? There's a news story about a unicorn or a Dacathorn, whatever, and that's what is celebrated too. That's what we view as success and successful. And, this is sort of a conflict for me that, in the work that we're doing at Boston Impact Initiative and in trying to support the companies we invest in is we invest in companies that, are or striving to get to payment of above livable wages, right? So, and we measure that annually to see where there are, and all of our companies are above the livable wage, which is here, we peg that at above $17.70 something cents. So they're paying above that. Who owns and controls the business, right? So is ownership by, women, people of color, who are the investors in that business, right? Is it majority owned? Who are the decision makers? Are workers part of that decision making? Who's on the board, who's on the management team? So we look at decision making and control and ownership, and want to keep shifting ownership and control into people of color and immigrants. And lastly, we also look at impact on their local economy. Like, what's the relationship with suppliers? Are they also, are they purchasing from other businesses owned by people of color, or by women? Are they employing locally, right, in their community? Are they employing those workers? So how do they contribute to their, right, local stakeholders? So all of that is part of the work that we're doing, but we have to scale it, right? And we
Yeah.
have to value that. So I, very much appreciate all the examples that you gave, because I think that, it's being done in a lot of pockets, but in order to tip the scale towards a real shift to the solidarity economy, it has to be exponentially grown. And we all have to be, I want to say, evangelists for how we could have better business models, like you said, that treat workers better, right? That treat their customers, at the highest levels of service, and that, start to think about how we also view returns, right? So one thing that we do differently too is in our investor base, right? So we wanted to have community participate in our fund. Oftentimes,
Yeah.
what we call non-accredited investors, people that, are not wealthy, cannot participate in investment funds. So we actually structured our fund as a nonprofit so that community ownership, right, could take place. And we have notes that have a 3% return, but it's subsidized by our philanthropy notes. So basically, wealthier investors are de-risking the community investment, and it allows for community to begin to engage in the exercise of building their investment muscle. Because in the end, you still have to invest in order to build wealth, whether it's investing in your real estate, in your home where you live, or in your business, or in businesses of others. You have to put in capital, monetary capital and human capital, social capital, and build those networks that are necessary for businesses to succeed. Because the money alone doesn't get you there, right? It's
No.
really the community around you. So
I did, from what you said, two things I think are things I would like to lift up. One is it's incredibly important what you measure, and it's also incredibly important what story you tell. So you're measuring all of the right things: community ownership, community control, worker wages.
ecological impact. Yep.
Exactly. When you think about the main measure we use, GDP, if you destroy the earth, it adds to GDP. Women's labor in the home doesn't count in GDP. Racial disparities, can't detect it in GDP. The tremendous economic inequality that emerged during the era of COVID, GDP still grew. So GDP doesn't respect the environment. It's sexist, it's racist, and it's classist. Aside from that, what a dandy economic measure. So we really need to figure out how we measure progress. We also need to figure out what story we tell. And I think you really lifted that up. I often talk about the fact that my dad was undocumented, and now I'm a full professor at the University of Southern California. And a lot of people like that story because it sounds like a racial oucher story. Family worked hard, which I suppose we did. And this is the result. But in the 30s, when my dad lacked papers, he had a union that defended his rights at work. And when he came back from the war, there was a GI Bill that allowed him, with very little money, to buy a house and get a piece of the American dream. And he also had access to a community college so that he had dropped out in 6th grade. He could go and take classes on electricity and shift from being a janitor to being an air conditioner repairman, and her family could go from being poor to being working class. And I grew up in La Puente, which is a suburb east of East LA, where the schools were decent because we were investing in them. And when the time came for me to go to the university, there was affirmative action to take a chance on a kid like me that did not fit the typical profile. So we need to give up the individualistic Horatio Alger story and start talking about the public policies and social movements that make it possible for us to achieve success. Because when we recognize that our success is mutual and that it entails obligations to make sure that other people can be successful as well, that's a different narrative and it will lead us to different measurement.
Absolutely. I've been a believer in more and more just the power of activism, of the grassroots, right? The policy, because it could be grass tops and grassroots, but we need them both, and they both have to be in solidarity with each other in order to truly drive forth those types of policies that we're seeing have real impact. So I want to close us out with a final question. And it is often the personal, what can I do, right? How can I participate and either, politically, from a policy perspective, maybe it's grassroots organizing, maybe, I often say just buy local, support your local business, your women-owned business, but what other things can our Latino community do, right, to become this key player in shifting the tides towards the solidarity economy? I think our audience is going to want to know, what can I personally do at work, at home? And I'd like to close us that way so that we have a call to action to our Latino community.
Well, I think if you are running a business or have a voice in a business, to interrogate your practices with regard to fairness, inclusion, and equity, not just diversity, whether or not you get different people there, but how fair and inclusive and equitable the opportunities are. And are you really leaving a lot of talent that could be lifted up to one side? So if you own a business, how are you treating your workers? If you're in middle management, how are you asking the company to do better by the environment, by the community, and by its workforce? I think if you're a policymaker, ask the question, how are you engaging the grassroots? You're absolutely right. Grass tops, grassroots together can grow a much better garden. And that happens when you, as a policymaker, become less fearful of community engagement and more welcoming of that voice. And then finally, as a community leader, I think a couple of things are crucial. One is to continue to think about enhancing the political power and voice of the Latina community, of businesses, of unions, because so many of our people are workers and unions are a vehicle for their voice, of the struggle to make sure that immigrants get full access, regardless of status, to the resources that will help them succeed. But most of all, Betty, I want to end with this. Ask yourself, how am I showing up for someone else's struggles? Not just how am I showing up for the Latino community if I'm Latino? How am I showing up for small businesses if I own a small business? How am I showing up for workers if I'm a worker? But how are you showing up against the anti-Black racism built into policing? How are you showing up around protecting our trans brothers and sisters? How are you showing up around Indigenous rights? How are you showing up around protecting Mother Earth? The habits of solidarity are not about bonding with people just like you. The habits of solidarity are about bridging to the other and expanding the circle of belonging so that solidarity means us all.
Yeah, again, I am so, so grateful for you and how you have framed this conversation for us because I don't think we often hear it this way, Manuel. Like often talk about solidarity as if we're a nice thing, this concept of mutuality, ay que bueno. But truly, yeah, this is really what is going to bring forth the type of catalytic change that we need to see. And, it reminds me of the quote, the Dr. King quote that says, in a real sense, all life is interrelated, right? All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. So, the Black struggle is our struggle too. The Asian, struggle is ours too. And working together, we can actually achieve progress and true change. And that is what I've been driven by that. I want to say exponentially in this past year because it came together personally for me because of my identity, the whole thing I shared with you earlier. And I have pushed that into the universe to say our organizations now need to be working together. So the Black policy agenda should be one we support, and their leaders should support the Latino agenda and the Asian agenda, and that is showing up for each other in ways that are we're seeing actually some real progress. So I want to thank you so much for doing this conversation with me, for being here at LTX Quest, and for sharing all of your wisdom. And I wish you a lot of success with the launch of your book. I'd love for you to come to Boston and do a book talk if I could so convince you.
I will take you up on that offer. Ha sido un gran placer estar contigo. And what a delight to get to know you and the great work you're doing to lift up and make real the solidarity economy through supporting these businesses and these cooperative enterprises and land trust, I'm assuming as well, which are absolutely key to offering an alternative, even as we move our broader capitalist economy in a more productive, positive, and people-oriented direction.
We are. Thank you so much.